Can ChatGPT replace programmers? My name is Andrew. Today we'll find out. I asked ChatGPT to write me 3 or 4 pieces of code, and each one is progressively harder. And today we'll find out if ChatGPT can replace programmers, so real people, our people, or if it's not capable of doing so yet. Let's start. So ChatGPT is a text AI. If you don't know, it's an AI that can respond you with anything that you want. So you just write a request, something like create Python CRUD users without libraries, and it responds you with your code. It can respond with horror story. It can respond with a simple answer. It can calculate stuff. It can do almost anything that you want. So go to chat.openai.com to find out more about that. And I also have a separate video on how to create your own ChatGPT in Python, so using that API, using their API. But today we'll find out if ChatGPT is capable of being a programmer. Let's start. So the first thing is create Python CRUD users without any libraries. We'll talk in Python because you've seen the profile picture of that channel, and Python is my favorite language. So create Python CRUD users without any libraries. So what is CRUD? CRUD is basically create, read, update, delete. So we can create our users, read our users, so get the users from some kind of data storage, update them and delete them. And here is the thing that ChatGPT gave to us. We have a list of users and we have functions: create user, read user, update and delete user. And also some examples on how we can use those functions. And that is pretty cool. So we already have a code that works and that can be used in our real project. But the thing is, that code has some problems that basic programmers cannot find out. Basic in sense of that they don't have enough knowledge. So what are the problems with that code? The first problem that I see as a developer is that you do not have ID for your user. You don't have an ID for your user, that unique identifier of an entity in your system. Why do we need that ID? And if you ask me, I would use ID as a number. So user number 1, user number 2, user number 3. So ID 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Just like in a relational or SQL database. So why do we need that ID? Because with ID, it's easier to distinguish between different users. Here, the only thing that we have for user is name and age. So name and age are the only 2 parameters of our user object. But it's almost always better to have that ID. To be honest, I did not say create users with ID. So that's good enough. But I, as a programmer, would add ID to that system. Aside from that, so ID is not that big of an issue. Like, that's my own preference. And that's probably the preference of most of the programmers. You need to have some kind of an ID that distinguishes one user from another. The real issue comes with update, read, and delete. What's the problem? Create user is good enough. Like, it's good enough. We can add ID, but it's good enough. When we look at read user, update user, and delete user, we can see one important thing, one important clause inside of that function or those functions. It's for loop. It's a for loop. For loop that goes through each user and then compares their username to the name that we provided in here. So the idea here is that we call a function read user with the name of our user, and then that user is returned. The thing is that when you read user just like that, when you read a user from a list using a loop, you spend a lot of time looking for that user. So that algorithm can be drastically improved if instead of using a list, we use a dictionary. And if we want to use a dictionary, we can implement that ID that I talked about in create user and have our users dictionary as users with the ID as a key and name and age as a value of that user. And how will that improve our code? Right now, we need to go through each user to find the user that we want to read or update or delete. But the thing is, if you have dictionaries work with big O as big O as 1, sorry. So big O notation, the complexity of that algorithm is 1. So you only need one step to find out if you have a user or not, if that user exists in your user's dictionary or not. And you only have to do one step in order to get the user that you're looking for. Here we have to do O, so big O, from n steps. We have to go through each user in the worst case scenario to find our user that we're looking for in the read user, update, or delete user function. So the problem with that code, the biggest problem that is really obvious, is that we have for loops. We don't really want to use those for loops because we can optimize that code with a dictionary. just like this. Aside from that, I also see return none and return none here. Return none is not necessary, so yeah, we don't really need it. So read user return none is unnecessary because by default, Python functions return none. Let's go to the second example, add SQL Alchemy. If you don't know about SQL Alchemy, it's basically an ORM, object relation mapping for Python. So it allows you to connect to the database in Python and use classes as tables. That's it. So read about it if you don't know about it, if you just start with Python, but yeah, that's it. So what we're doing here is we create all the necessary things like engines, base, we create our user. Right now it's a user table in the database and we have ID. Here we already have an ID, so integer primary key true. Me, once again, I would personally add that ID inside of here as well. But yeah, right now we have ID in our table, we have name and age. That's all right. Then we use base metadata create all to create all the tables in our database. And then we create a session, we connect to the database, and we use create user, read user, update user, delete user. The problem in that code is not in the queries themselves. Some queries can be improved. They can be improved. Aside from that, we don't really want to use those queries in here because if we use different architectures in Python, then it can be, yeah, we can move queries to the separate class, we can move queries to the separate layer of our code. There are lots of things on how we can improve our code. But the basic idea in that code is good enough. So the basic thing that ChatGPT wrote for our request, for our query, is good enough. We can create, read, update, or delete our users. That's good. And they're saved in the database, everything works, it's good. But we also have a problem. What is that problem? What's the problem that we can see here? The problem is that that session object is opened in the global scope. So it's not opened in the function create, read, update, or delete user. It's in the global scope. And why is that a problem? The thing is that we will not open a session to the database when we need to do something with the database, but we'll open a session to the database in the global scope. So that's memory, resources, CPU, and a lot of stuff that is unnecessary. What would be better is that if we move that session inside of create user, read user, update, and delete user. Or what's even better is that if we create a function called create session, and then that returns a new session object. And then we use that function everywhere. But what's the problem here? Is that you don't want to open a session, you don't want to open a connection that is not used right away. Why is that? Because imagine that we just create those functions, but we never use them in our code. We just create those functions and we have them. The problem is that our database has a session bounded to it. So we have a session that is bound to the database. And that is the real problem in that code. Because in one of my projects, in one of the projects I worked on, I removed like 20% or 50% of CPU or decreased CPU usage by 20% just by removing those sessions. So those sessions were everywhere. And it slows down our database, it can ruin our database completely, and it also slows down our code. So unnecessary resources, unnecessary memory, and all that stuff, just move your session inside of your create, read, update, and delete user. So that is kind of problems that ChatGPT cannot distinguish, because ChatGPT is not advanced enough yet to know that session should be opened in here. And now let's go to the third part of our code, and I think, okay, it's not the last part, but yeah, one of the last parts, add fast API. So right now, what our code has, we have basic CRUD, so create, read, update, delete, we have a database. Right now, what we need to add is an API. So if you don't know anything about fast API, it's basically a library in Python that allows you to create web applications. And here what we have app as fast API, so we import all the things, we create our app, we create our engine, declarative base. It's actually better to create all of that before you create an app in the fast API. And it's also better to create all the required tables before you create that fast API app. So you have your app ready and all the database schema, all the database structure is ready as well. But it's okay, so it's fine. Then session here, session opened in the global scope again. That's a problem. In fast API, if you want to open up a session, well, you have lots of tutorials in the official documentation, but what you want to do is have a dependency in your fast API. Or you just can open your session inside of your function just like that. But yeah, that is very, very bad. Then we have two models, and the model is basically the structure of your response. What kind of, request. What kind of data you need to send, well, actually response and request. What kind of data you need to send in the request and what kind of data you will receive in the response. User create and user update classes are responsible for that. They basically show it. So base model is a model from Pydantic, and you have name and age here. So name is a string and age is an integer. As a user, you know that you will receive name and age as your response to user/name, kind of like that. But the problem here is that user create and user update functions do not use ORM mode. In Pydantic, so in that library, you have something called ORM mode. So ORM mode, object relational mapping mode. It allows you to easily convert those kind of objects, the objects that we create with SQL Alchemy, to Pydantic objects. It's very, very easy. You just have to write one line and then use a function that converts your objects to those models. But that's not a big problem. You can improve that code with ORM mode, but well, ChatGPT omitted that, and let's not talk about it right now. What I want to talk about is the responses that ChatGPT returns in our URLs, in our routes. So route is basically a URL that executes some code when you make a request to that URL. So if I make a post HTTP request to user/create, we will have to provide user create. So we will have to provide name and age in our response or request, and ChatGPT, or the code that ChatGPT created, will create a new user, add it to the session, commit it to the database, so save that user, and then return our data. So return that new user data. What's the problem here? The problem is that it's better to use Pydantic schemas. I call them schemas or Pydantic models when you return or request some data. So it's always better to return a Pydantic model than just writing your stuff like this. Why is that? Because Pydantic model allows you to write documentation. It allows you to do a lot of stuff with validations, with the ORM mode, with I don't know, a lot of stuff. You can add your own functions to your base models. You can do lots of stuff. Once again, it allows you to write documentation, or documentation will be written for you. Because if you use Pydantic model in your route in Fast API, it will automatically add it to the documentation. So you automatically know that you need to write name and age if you want to create a user. If you return your data just like this, it will, I actually don't remember it, but I think that it will not show it in the documentation. And even if it does, even if it shows in the documentation as ID, something, name, something, and age, something, it's better, just better, to use a Pydantic model. And I do not know why Fast API or ChatGPT did not use Pydantic model inside of here. So the only Pydantic models that we have are the models that we use in the requests themselves. So we know what kind of data we send to the server, but we don't know what kind of data we get from the server. Yeah. Okay. So users create, we should return a Pydantic model here. Here, message user not found can be just like that, but still it's not the best case scenario. It's better to return an exception or raise an exception. Then, of course, we can do something with a query. You can do a lot of stuff here, but all of that is not necessary right now. The thing is that, okay, user deleted and user not found, maybe, well, message can be left just like that. But always return a Pydantic model when you return some kind of entity from your Fast API. Okay, and then, yeah, Fast API, it has a lot of errors. So as you can see, as we go further and further in the complexity of the code, it introduces more and more errors. Because ChatGPT doesn't know how to write all the intricate stuff in our code. And then I use a thing called base response. So base response, in my opinion, and in the opinion of most of the programmers, is the thing that you have as a base class, so base, and every response that you send from your Fast API kind of inherits from that response. So basically, base response is a class or a function or something that allows you to format your data in a very readable manner. That's it. It just allows you to format your data. So let's say that you want to have every message with your API version. So every message should not just be okay, but it should be message okay and then let's say version 1.00. You want every message that you get from your REST API to be formatted like this: message or data or content or anything else, and then version. You can do that with a base response. So basically some kind of class, some kind of function that allows you to format your data. And I asked ChatGPT to write that base response. Of course, it didn't write it, but it wrote base response here. And I do not know why, but right now it raises HTTP exceptions here, here, and here. So basically it created a class called base response with message str, so message string. And I thought, okay, so, well, it didn't understand my query, so it just wants to do this kind of messages as a separate Pydantic class, as a separate base response class. But actually, no. If you look at it, it's not even a Pydantic class. It's just base response message str, and it's never used. That's what's bothering me. So it's never used. Base response is useless in that code. And also we, for some reason, raise exceptions now. We don't want to return message user deleted or message user not found. We want to raise exceptions. Once again, that's better, but I do not know why it didn't write it in the first version of that code. But yeah, I asked it to add a base response. Well, it added it. It also added exceptions, but base response is never used. Even if I look for base response on my page, as you can see, 0 of 1. So this one is 0 or this one is 1. So one match on the whole page. So we don't use that base response anywhere. It's just a class that is introduced because, I don't know, because we want that class to be introduced, because I asked for it. So ChatGPT did not understand my query. It did not recognize what it needed to do. And the problem is that I thought that ChatGPT is going to be advanced enough to not make any silly errors, just like base response message str, because that class contaminates your system. You have all the classes, all the components that you're using directly. Create user is used, user update is used, session is used, even if it's in the wrong place. So we open our session in the wrong place, session object is still used by that ChatGPT. App is used, engine is used, user is used. So every class, every function has a purpose. And lots of programmers forget to remove redundant classes, forget to remove parts of code that don't really need to be there. And I thought that, okay, ChatGPT knows how to write code, and at least it won't make those silly errors. Unfortunately, I was incorrect. So ChatGPT makes those kind of problems, make those kind of errors that create unnecessary code. And each unnecessary code, each unnecessary class increases your code base, so increases the package size, increases the slowness of your code, you need more memory and all that stuff. And aside from that, it's just harder to read it. So as you can see, ChatGPT can write some code. So it can write code that works. That code works, don't get me wrong. It works and it's all right. And it's very, very good for the ChatGPT, for the AI that does not involve any human things. But the problem with ChatGPT right now, and it will not replace the programmers, and here's why. The problem with ChatGPT right now is that ChatGPT can only write very simple code and it cannot look into the future. So what I mean by that? Users CRUD, create, read, update, delete, with Fast API, SQL Alchemy. That's the most basic project that you can ever write. That's like what all the people write when they want to start working with Python, want to start working with Python databases. You write a user management system, or you write some kind of system that has users in it. That's the most basic thing. And even in that thing, ChatGPT makes some mistakes. That's normal, because those mistakes are not easily recognizable. If I give that code to a junior developer, or even a middle developer, he or she will not get all the problems that I can get, or some other person who is better than me can get, because that's really, really hard. So for example, one problem that we can, or one thing that we can improve is that declarative base is not the best way to write models in SQL Alchemy. So it's not the best way. We can write it so that we only have one class that is used throughout our whole Fast API system. And we don't really need to convert our Pydantic models to other things. We don't really need to convert our user to some other thing like that. But yeah, that's also a problem because Pydantic does not allow that to happen, so we need to write some other code. And as you can see, there are lots of intricacies in every program, even in that simple program that is finished in like 50 or 60 lines. Aside from that, so first thing is that ChatGPT writes very, very, very simple code. If you only write simple code, if you can only Google, it's not that you Google in your work, but if you can only Google your code, so if you cannot write anything by yourself, or if you don't remember, okay, I had this error, I did not know how to solve this problem, now I know because I Googled it and everything's fine. If you can only Google your code, ChatGPT is going to replace you for sure. If it's not going to be ChatGPT, some other system, some other programmer, someone will replace you. But if you can write code that cannot be written by ChatGPT, so let's say you can write code that involves some kind of, well, I'll give you an example. You want to make an insurance for Binance systems because, well, don't get into it, but you want to make an insurance for some kind of system that involves another system. So an example, if you know what I mean, you want to make an insurance for Binance and decentralized cryptocurrency in Polygon. If Binance fails, your Polygon cryptocurrency allows users to get their funds back. So it's kind of like an insurance. Or you want to write some code that gets data from one source, converts it, gets it to another source, or saves it in your database, or let's say processes that data, or does anything with it. If you want to write that kind of code, if you want to solve really hard issues, and not even hard issues, because you can write the code in a very simple, and you should start with very simple projects. But the more you know, the harder it is to replace you. That's the most important thing that I want to tell you. And if you only know how to write basic code, if you only know how to Google and copy your code, once again, Googling is not bad, but I'm just saying, ChatGPT is going to replace you. That's for sure. And aside from that, one important thing, and by the way, we should use ID here, not name. We already have ID in our system. Why do we use name? Well, that's for another thing, but yeah, we should use ID in CRUD, not name. We can use name, but that's very, very weird. Okay, but one thing that ChatGPT cannot do, and it showed it in here, is look into the future. One important thing is that when people write code, some people, they just write the code, okay, it does the work, fine. Let's just finish our work day, or let's just go do something else, or let's just write another feature. The problem is that ChatGPT cannot look into the future. So what do I mean by that? It cannot get that code for user create, read, update, delete has already been written in here. So we have 4 functions: create, read, update, delete. We have those 4 functions. Why not use these functions inside of our FAST API requests, FAST API routes? Why do we need to copy the same code? Because if I look for that code, so new user, we create a user, we add it to the session, we commit. If I go up, I can see that create user basically does the same thing. And what we could have done is used that create user function inside of our create user route. Just like that. Aside from that, ChatGPT doesn't know how to optimize code. It doesn't know how to do very, very complex stuff. It doesn't know what is going to happen with the code. It can only answer to a simple query, just like add fast API or do something else. Of course, if you specify a lot of stuff like, okay, use dictionaries for users, add indices to SQL Alchemy, use services, use repositories, use units of works, use the best, use some kind of library. It can work with that code, but it's still going to have a lot of errors. So the only thing that you need to do is just study. Study, learn new stuff. That's it. Because if you don't study and if you're a programmer that just does the job, gets paid, and that's it, ChatGPT is going to replace you. Because if you can only write this kind of code, well, ChatGPT already replaced you. Because I'm sorry, it can write it as well for $0, well, even if for $100, without any problems, without any bugs. That's it. Kind of like that. So what I'm trying to say is that ChatGPT is not going to replace programmers in the near future, but a lot of programmers are going to be replaced, just like other professions. So be the best or be nobody. Thank you for watching. My name is Andrew. Subscribe to my channel, leave a like, leave a comment. Look at my Python PySimulator module. Thank you for watching and bye-bye.